that we do take a business owner mindset. So when we're making an investment, our thought process is that we are purchasing a fractional ownership interest in a business, a piece of a business. We're not trading pieces of paper on the stock market.
Right. And Ben had mentioned bottom up, and I think it kind of came up in the call a little bit. How much your bottom up investors? How much does the macro view come into play, if at all? How does that factor into the equation?
I would say that, outside of exceptional circumstances, it really doesn't directly influence our investment decision making. Like probably any interested, curious investor, we kind of know what's going on in the world, and we read about it, and insofar as there are things like trade wars or tariffs that may influence or impact our investments or a company that we might be doing research on, we certainly take that into consideration. We're not ignorant to it, but we certainly do not try to employ any tactical or strategic asset allocation from the top down in terms of geography or sector or industry or anything like that. The portfolios are constructed on a case-by-case basis based on the merits of the individual businesses that we're acquiring a fractional ownership interest in the business. So whatever is happening with the macro environment, insofar as it may or may not have a direct or indirect impact on the companies themselves, that's where we would focus our attention. As far as where interest rates are going to be this year or next year, or what the Fed's going to do, or what the ECB is going to do, or any central bank's going to do with monetary policy, or anything like that, that doesn't directly enter into our thought process.
Right.
And the reason for that, I think, it's not just we made a call not to do that, right? We think there's way more value in the micro dynamics of a business than there is in the macro dynamics of a country. So there are plenty of examples of great businesses that did really well, generated massive shareholder value in very challenging macro environments. And the opposite's also true. Great macro environments that are helpful for companies and for entrepreneurs that have had a lot of examples of companies that have gone bankrupt. In fact, potentially a very open market, GDP that's growing a lot, can be extremely competitive, and you can see a lot of bankruptcies. In a market where GDP is growing significantly, right?
Sure.
Versus some EM, like we've given examples in our presentation of like a country like Brazil going through 20 years ago for 2.5 decades, hyperinflation, massive unemployment, multiple currencies, and being a very well-performing stock market in US dollar terms. Because the companies that made the index, or potentially someone's portfolio, were monopolies and oligopolies with strong competitive advantages and local growth opportunities. Right? So,
right.
Just as a point on that, and maybe for the Brazil examples, how much of an example? And I mean, this team always talks about a lot of the businesses you own very global in nature. But in a case like Brazil, is it because they've been more internally focused or more kind of globally focused? Is that how you've managed to have a more resilient stock market in a less than favorable macro environment?
No, I think it's not. I think the answer is because the companies that were listed were monopolies and oligopolies for the most part that had very, very high returns on capital, and that comes from Brazil being a very, in part, and the same is true for a country like Mexico, for example, and so you have these monopolies, these oligopolies, very high returns. If it's a local business, local competitive advantage, but you have businesses that have done well, even going internationally in those countries. But yeah, if you go into a new market, and that's a new micro landscape, you're going to fight new competitors, and so it depends. It's a company by company thing. What is fair to say about the group as a whole is, I think, there was a higher proportion of of monopolies and oligopolies that had high returns. And usually that bodes well for shareholders. Not every time, but, if it's a state-owned monopoly that destroys value, then potentially not. But that was kind of the case. And Brazil, for example, and I give the example of Brazil just because I'm from there, right? But is opening up now, and there's more competition. It might be great for GDP growth. It might not be great for some companies that had monopolies before, right? So, a company like Cielo, which we've owned, used to be a monopoly in acquiring Visa transactions, and then the market opened up and it really suffered. So the acquiring market is going to grow in Brazil. People are there's a massive transition from cash-based economy to cards. If it's way more competitive and prices are going down because there can be entrants and things like that. So that's what we're kind of trying to figure out business by business. So sometimes things don't look great from a macro perspective, but a business can really do well if, in its local competitive landscape, it's got significant advantages, right? Yeah. So the same is true for China, the opposite side, right? Like nowadays, China has a lot of great tech companies at very high returns, but 15, 20 years ago, it was growing significantly, right? 9% GDP growth compounded for 2 decades. The stock market didn't do really well because it was very competitive. A lot of those businesses were manufacturing businesses with no competitive advantages. And look at the difference now. Now you have companies like Alibaba and Tencent that are very dominant, are monopolies or duopolies or oligopolies in each of their markets, and then those are generating significant shareholder returns. So, different type of economy now, consumer-driven, but it's not a macro thing. I mean, certain companies will benefit from a macro trend, but in the end, it's do you dominate this market, do you have high returns, and do you have growth opportunities to allocate capital, right?
Yeah. And further to that point, there's actually three former professors of mine from my business degree from London Business School that have published a seminal work in investment returns over long periods of time. It's called Triumph of the Optimists. And every year they update it, and it's actually called the Investment Returns Yearbook in partnership with Credit Suisse. Credit Suisse publishes it. And they've done probably more work on asset class returns almost than anybody pretty much on the planet over long periods of time. And the conclusion that they came to, and it's available in that publication, the Investment Returns Yearbook, that there's actually a statistically insignificant but inverse correlation, small inverse correlation, even though statistically insignificant, inverse relationship between GDP growth and stock market returns of a country. So,
So long-term GDP. So, if you have a table, we're not saying next year's GDP growth versus, because on average, GDP growth goes up and stock market go up, right? But that's not potentially not what we're talking about. We're talking about if you have 15 years of GDP growth across many countries, is that useful data to forecast which stock market did better or worse? And the correlation, like Dana said, is 0 to negative. So because you have these countries like Brazil growing at 2%, stock market returns of double digit, and then you have countries like potentially China during that time, and now it's changed. And why has it changed? Is it because it's a better macro? Is it because it's better businesses? Right? Yeah. We think it's the latter.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, no. And then I'm just going to kind of circle it back here and so this is kind of one of those non-polished off record things. But I noticed that the way that the question was written here, and we've been talking a lot about it, and maybe hopefully it was useful information that you can use. But the way this is written here, this question specifically, how much time do you spend analyzing the macro view? The short answer is none.
Yeah. Which is that's the answer we wanted to get. It's really, some of these are kind of softball questions, but they like to highlight some of those points. So, yeah. So that's the answer we want.
Can I just make another point on how we look? I think when you look at it like a style box, I think with a Morningstar, our portfolio sometimes looks on the growthier side, right? And then